and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. The series now hits 2005 and we look at the second Amorphous Androgynous psychedelic album, Alice in Ultraland. Release date 26th of August 2005. In 2003 it was announced that the band were negotiating a record deal for new albums by both Amorphous Androgynous and the future sound of London, thus making them separate, ongoing projects. We now know that nothing came of the supposed FSOL album, but Amorphous did continue. In May 2004, during the Six Mix show, 3 new tracks were played and announced at the end to be from the new Amorphous Androgynous album, Alice in Ultraland, one of many titles originally suggested for the Isness. Several tracks on the album were then played during the live band gigs in Russia and Sweden. After the years of silence and very gradual rollout of the new sound that preceded the Isness, this all felt remarkably conventional. In 2005, news began to trickle out slowly, the way it always does with Brian and Gaz's music, including information about Amorphous becoming a live 6-piece supergroup who would partake in a world tour following the album's release, set for July or August on EMI's Harvest imprint. Although promoted as being the album that resurrected Harvest, the label was still going strong at the time, albeit largely with reissues rather than new material. New official sites for FSOL and Amorphous launched around this time, the FSOL one being an archive page about the band's history, largely sourced from my own site, with the Amorphous one promoting the new album via videos and a track-by-track guide. Eventually online stores began offering the album for pre-order under the surprising name The Amorphous Androgynous. At the time, assumed to be an error, the definite article has become a permanent part of the band's name since, apparently as an attempt to separate the project from the 1993 incarnation of Amorphous. Stable Doors might be mentioned at this point, and most press coverage of the band since has omitted the. Cover, tracklist and all eventually appeared online. I was fortunate enough to receive a promo CD a month or so before the release and shared my thoughts with fans online. This was the last major release before the FSOL list died off forever. The promo CD's cover seemed to be a really positive step, no mention of FSOL at all other than the production credit. This version of the cover even appeared on Amazon as such. A big disappointment then when the final cover was revealed to include the words "The Future Sound of London Present" on the sleeve itself, not just on a sticker. Even the spine states FSOL Presents. For a while it seemed like the Amorphous project would never be given opportunity to exist as a separate band in its own right. The Harvest logo on the cover, however, feels like an intentional move on the band's part to line the album up with classics by Pink Floyd and Deep Purple. The cover is effectively an updated version of 2004's Divinity sleeve with even more lens flares, the subject of much fan ire. The rear cover features the tracklist in warped text. The Wicker doll is in a very different font, suggesting the track may have been added at the last minute, or perhaps just forgotten when designing the sleeve. There's also a block of text describing the music as a sampledelic, funkoid, rocktronic, cosmic, ambient oozescape, and lots of other nonsense about psychedelic dreams, cosmic consciousness, lizards, and his motherness. In line with the more stripped-down band sound, the booklet is far more succinct than that of the Isness, with 12 pages of gold textures, classical-looking art, lyrics, and a double page of credit and thanks. Only a couple of shots of the band are present. For the double LP version, credits are spread over the gatefold and rear sleeve, with far less art in general and no printed lyrics, no band photo at all. The initial CD copies were released in a gold effect slipcase. All come with an advert for Amorphous Androgynous ringtones, the Witchfinder Indian Swing, High and Dry and The Prophet, that caused much amusement on the FSOL list. The album is the only release to feature phonographic copyright credited to Earthbeat Productions. Gaz and Brian appear largely in their roles as one-man band of Cosmos and Stone Freshwaters in the credits, with their own home studios credited as Highgate Esher and Tree-Lined River. Someone called His Motherness, probably Gaz, is also credited as engineer. The vinyl edition was limited to 1,000 copies and is machine numbered on the front cover. I'm lucky enough to own number 3. It goes for ludicrous sums on the internet now, and given that the rights have now been returned to the band, it's hoped that a reissue is very, very soon coming. Promotional imagery for the album featured pictures of what appeared to be a band lineup, including guest vocalist Dave Sanderson, Gaz's girlfriend Diane Harris, 2 friends, one of whom, Chris, hosted the 7th Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Mix. Not, however, anything resembling the actual band. The horse probably had more say in the music than the 2 hippies in the background. Musically, the album is clearly from the same people as the Isness, and yet also very different. A lot of the record stems from the Isness sessions, with many tracks originating in the late 90s, the tracks credited as being engineered by Yage at Earthbeat. but worked on as a smaller jam band rather than featuring a broad range of guest musicians. This approach stemmed from Gaz's desire to make the Amorphous more of a live band, allowing both for touring and for the music to align closer with his influences at the time. This lineup, Mikey Rowe, Stu Rowe, Tim Weller and Gary Lucas, performs most of the music, and the jam format gives the album a uniformity that makes it stand apart from the scattershot nature of the isness. Most of the tracks run for around 5 to 6 minutes, most feature steady live drums. The overall feel runs closer to the groove-based psych-funk music played on later Monstrous bubble mixes, particularly on the instrumentals. Songs like High and Dry and In the Summertime of Consciousness hark back to the earlier 60s psych-pop approach, and The World is Full of Plankton is another prog epic. Another Fairy Tale Ending and The Wicker Doll are the only tracks to pick up the modern classical and ambient strain of the previous record. Baluji Srivastav's Indian instrumentation only features on 2 tracks, removing that element of the band's sound almost completely. Possibly the biggest development in sound comes in the form of environments that close many of the tracks, consisting of twinkling synths, odd samples and field recordings. Although not quite as atmospheric as typical FSOL environments, they do add a soundscape feel to the album that had been largely missing in the band's original music since 1997, with more than half the tracks linked to at least one other. Given the mostly positive response to the isness, one might expect the press to be intrigued by the development of the Amorphous project. Sadly not. In fact, as far as I'm aware, the album received only one professional review in Prog Rock magazine. Otherwise, it was met with absolute silence. This was pretty surprising given the release on EMI, the Harvest link dated back to the band's Cosmic Jukebox remixes in the early 2000s, connected by Brian's then partner Paula Flack, who worked with the label, who, as a major label, one would expect to have given the album a significant promotional push. One way or another, the album was either forgotten or ignored or simply not promoted properly. Around the release, Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble mixes were broadcast on XFM and 6 Music, no doubt helping keep some of the public interested, but overall it was a very quiet release. Fan reaction was typically mixed, some expressing disappointment in the continuation of a project they had little interest in, especially in the context of the new FSOL album rumours, and Gaz's late 2002 interviews saying things like, "Now that I've done this and I'm involved with this, I'm getting back into my machines." But most feeling somewhat warmer to the album than its predecessor. Many things fed into this: the expectation, knowing what an Amorphous record might sound like, the environments linking tracks, making it feel more FSOL-like, the general lack of sitar, a controversial instrument for many, the darker, more ambient closing run of tracks. Indeed, the Wicker Doll was picked up as a favourite by some on the FSOL list, with someone stating that if this was a hint of where the new FSOL material was going, they were excited. It would take a few more years, but this was to be a remarkably prescient comment. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the album failed to reach the UK top 100 albums. As for me, despite a glowing initial response, I gave it a pitchfork-like 8.7 out of 10 on the FSOL list on my site. It's not an album I find myself returning to very much these days. A lot of the appeal of the isness for me is how bizarre and fun it is, moving from one short track to another in a radically differing style. I also generally enjoy the 60s psych pop meets electronica with a hint of prog approach. The more live band, groove-oriented jam approach of Alice in Ultraland is generally less in my musical area. I find the less varied sound tends to teeter uncomfortably on the borderline between consistent and boring. Some tracks, such as The Prophet, I tend to find a bit too chaotic with far too much going on, contrasted with the spaciousness of tracks like Go Tell It to the Tree's Egghead and High Tide on the Sea of Flesh. A lot of Alice in Ultraland feels kind of bloated. There are still tracks I love on the album. The second half in particular ticks a lot of boxes for me, especially In the Summertime of Consciousness, The World is Full of Plankton and The Wicker Doll. On the whole though, it feels like the point where the Amorphous Androgynous began to move in a direction less appealing to me, and I've probably given FSOL releases far more attention in the years since. I have even begun to wonder whether my enthusiasm about Amorphous at the time was largely due to just being desperate for any Dougans Cobain material. Around the album's release, a CDR containing a radio edit of the Witchfinder appeared online, and a music video for the track was cited on MTV too, sparking possibility of more material from the sessions. And then all went quiet for a long time. No multi-part single emerged. An Australian tour happened with no promotion at all. One final Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble mix was broadcast, and then silence. The lack of reviews, the lack of singles, the album not charting, the FSOL list going very quiet, Brian not even appearing in the live shows, it really felt like it was over. FSOL list member MCB Pete opened an online forum called FSOL Board in late 2005, and it wasn't long before a thread popped up asking if this really was the end. The answer to that, not in the slightest, but that's a topic for another day. The emptiness of nothingness. Seemingly developed out of the Divinity sessions, sharing vocals and brass with the original and even listed as Divinity in its performance at the Arvika festival, and initially named The Otherness, The Emptiness of Nothingness is a fine example of how closely tied the Isness and Alice in Ultraland really are. Led by piano and wailing wordless vocals, the track is a bold opening statement. In the words of Stone Freshwaters, it has to be epic, it has to be sonic, it has to sound like a band at the height of its game, but also a band who use the studio technology as the ultimate gizmo. More than this, it has to create a profound bang, but no explosion. In other words, it can't give the game away immediately. Certainly fulfills all of these expectations, a minute-long build-up, the main musical section, a breakdown, and then back into the main theme again. There's also lots going on in the background, swirling organs, electronic noises, a flute loop that comes and goes occasionally, all placed into the track in a way the usual unidentified samples would be included in an FSOL track. In contrast, the presence of Tim Weller on drums makes it feel far less electronic overall and more like the work of an actual band. The final minute builds down with a guitar loop, electronic noises, organs and flutes, increasingly divorced from the main track into what feels very much like a closing environment, which then crossfades into the next track. The Witchfinder. Another track performed live before the album, the Witchfinder finds Brian and Gaz heading further into rock territory than they'd gone before. As the track's working title, Zepp, suggests, it's a musical homage to Led Zeppelin. While Gaz attempted the vocals on 2004's live version, the studio track features Dave Sanderson singing. He manages a fairly good 70s hard rock vocal, generally fitting for the track. Starting with layers of acoustic guitar and some Belugi sitar, plus various backing samples and sounds, it's all very typical Amorphous fare for the first couple of minutes. Once Sanderson's vocal starts, the track moves towards the rockier section, announced with a chunky breakbeat, big guitar chords and a Give You All of My Love chorus. A guitar outro acts as a link to the next track. Described as being inspired by the film The Wicker Man, a live recording of Led Zeppelin's Tangerine, and a childhood fear of witches, the lyrics are about how witches were simply people who saw the world differently or in a different way, and how other enlightened people have been murdered or made outcasts over the years. Apparently, it mostly seems to just be about God existing in love rather than as a deity and people being inherently good. Your enjoyment of this track will probably depend on how much you enjoy this type of music it references. For me, let's just say it's one of my less favourite Amorphous songs and leave it at that. The Witch Hunt. Effectively part 2 of a suite starting with The Witchfinder, The Witch Hunt is an instrumental breaks track, fast-paced drum loops backed with samples of skronking saxophone, plus chopped and mangled vocal and guitar parts of The Witchfinder. A shrieking violin melody leads the first half of the track, which is interestingly credited to Bo, Brian's daughter, recorded in the nursery by his wife Lisa. Bo would have been pretty young at this point, so if that's actually her, she's clearly a talented violin player. After a couple of band tracks, The Witch Hunt brings things back to a more FSOL sound. Upon hearing The Witch Hunt on his iPod while getting his customary morning coffee from Brick Lane, Stone Freshwaters was moved to explain, "I saw bleeding witches everywhere. All is harvest." As first heard on the 6 Mix broadcast and later at the Fisher and Arvika gigs, All Is Harvest was very eagerly anticipated fans as it became popular via bootlegs. Known originally as Air, when the official tracklist was announced by the band's management, they were keen to point out that the piece was still on there, just under a different name. Program drums were seen as a bit of a disappointment after Tim Weller's live drums heard in the Arvika recording, but otherwise the track has remained a firm favourite from the album. Built around a beautiful Mikey Rowe piano chord sequence over which Stu Rowe plays a mournful melody on guitar, it's a laid-back, melancholic piece of music. Both Rows receive a co-writing credit for it. The piece is named after EMI's Harvest imprint who released the album. Brian and Gaz also remixed much work from the Harvest Vault, still unreleased, and the track's creation was inspired by Pink Floyd, a famous Harvest band. The track is the first on Alice Ultraland to be bookended by silence. The Prophet. First heard on the Abbey Road mispressed version of the Isness as a 53-second sketch called Yes My Brother, the funk interlude was taken back to the studio for a radical upgrade. Its inclusion on the original Isness was bizarre in itself, a short funk track when so many full tracks were left off the album. The mispressed liner notes feature the only post-90s reference to Philip Pinn, playing the superbly named Crotch-O-Matic bass modulation. Now appearing as a 5-minute jam session, The Prophet owes much to Mikey Rowe, whose various improvisations lead the track. Stu Rowe's guitar completes the piece. Inspired by Miles Davis's fusion era, it's very much tied to the 70s jazz funk sound. It's probably also the epitome of the chaotic side of the album, with guitar, Hammond, bass, Moog and samples often all playing at once. I for one wish it had much more room to breathe. Miles Davis's stuff was so spacious. This really is an odd thing to be inspired by him. Still, there's dynamic in the structure, if not the layers, with plenty of stop-start sections and countless different elements coming and going. The final minute of the track forms the album's second environment, with layers of synth strings and twisted guitars fading into a bed of twinkling synth arpeggios, acting as a brief prelude to another fairy tale ending. The track ends on some synth sweeps first heard over a decade before on Lifeform Ends. Intriguingly and slightly disappointingly, the fillet pin credit for crotch-o-matic bass modulation on Yes My Brother is changed to the less pervy growler bass for Alice in Ultraland's credits. There's also a Soundproc K46 mentioned, probably another FSOL invention. Indian Swing. Probably the oldest track on Alice in Ultraland, Indian Swing dates back to 1997, with a very early prototype played on June's Fun radio transmission. Interestingly, the engineered by Yage at Earthbeat credit is absent in the liner notes here. While the drum and bass style of that version is clearly absent here, the programmed drums do feature a similar pattern, with Tim Weller fleshing them out on a live kit. Effectively an opportunity for Belushi to play some sitar, whose performance leads the bulk of the track. It's a very pleasant piece, but not really the most memorable. The Indian feel and programmed drums actually make it sound closer to the Isness, although the inclusion of more sounds from another fairy tale ending tie it in with the album. Stu Rowe's guitar, heavily processed, provides an atmospheric break in the middle. As with The Prophet, I've always felt there's just too much going on throughout the bulk of the track. It's just chaotic and busy. The Prophet's closing environment returns in a new mix to close the track and lead into the next piece. The Season's Turn. Effectively a brief environment in itself, The Season's Turn acts as an introductory piece to High and Dry. Fading in from Indian Swing, it begins with birdsong, Hammond organ and a voice stating "My whole ambition is for love," sampled from The Encouragement of the Lusty Wife by Chitra Neoji. Gaz, in his first vocal on the album, amazingly, sings "Look at how the seasons turn when the sun returns." Over an organ drone, some reversed sounds come in, and then it's all over, leading into the musically linked High and Dry. Bizarrely, it occupies the spot at the end of side B on the 2LP version, meaning the two connected tracks are not only on separate sides but separate slabs of vinyl. When the Isness was first announced on the band's official online store under the name Galaxial Pharmaceutical in 2001, it featured a track called Seasons as track 5. As this has never reappeared, and as The Season's Turn later ended up at the end of Meadows on the 2018 Abbey Road version, it has been assumed by fans that the two are in fact the same track. High and Dry. Originally heard in 2001's Psychedelic Manifesto video, High and Dry was eagerly awaited by some fans, myself included. As a fan of Gaz's psych pop songs, I was hoping for more of this type of material, meaning hearing this track on Alice in Ultraland was an exciting moment. Despite the breakbeat, it's a fairly standard sounding psych pop song with twangy guitars, verse and chorus structure, and Gaz doing some Mick Jagger-esque vocals. A breakdown into piano and gospel choir has a very slightly different fidelity to the rest of the track, suggesting it was recorded much later, perhaps a symptom of the song's very long gestation. The gospel choir, intriguingly, is entirely Dave Sanderson. Both his and Gaz's vocals were described as preposterous by Gaz himself, which is fair. One of the backing vocals sounds remarkably like the baby soup dragon from the Clangers. It's a very fun song that, if taken too seriously, could be considered a bit pretentious, but retains a certain spontaneity despite the 4-year production cycle. Lyrically, it was the "she used to live on the east side of town" line that really appealed to me on hearing the Psychedelic Manifesto, being a fan of lyrics about the mundane. The rest of it seems to be about love, more in the spiritual communal sense than the romantic, so fairly standard Gaz fare there. Yes, my brother, you've got to turn yourself around. The start of a run of 3 tracks with no environments or crossfades. With the same name as the mispressed Isness track, but only sharing its drum loop, Yes My Brother, You Gotta Turn Yourself Around is a hard piece to place. Built around Gaz's acoustic guitar, despite being instrumental other than some very nasal la-la-las by Gaz, it follows a verse-chorus structure, making it kind of feel like you're missing the vocals. The verse features electric guitar and harmonica samples, the chorus being led by the la-la-las. It's a very simplistic track, especially by Gaz and Brian's standards, with surprisingly little development over the course of its 5 minutes. Although the drums at least come from the Isness session, the rest of the track's Americana feel is very much in line with the rockier direction Gaz was taking Amorphous at the time. In the Summertime of Consciousness. By far the weirdest track on Alice in Ultraland. The flute intro suggests an Indian sounding piece before things move into piano and sax territory. Jazz time? No, Gaz is lying on the floor with the clouds spinning, drunken, caterwauling across the sky. The most overtly psychedelic sounding song on the album, he sings a lot of enjoyable gobbledygook to a truly off-kilter melody that seems to be permanently descending. Then it's back to jazz with sax, double bass and very lo-fi drums. As this section comes to a close, Gaz appears to be evilly cackling in the background. I've always loved this one because of how utterly bonkers it is. After a second sax section, what sounds like an entire rock band is fed through the machines and filtered and looped over the top of the drums with guitar textures, Hammond organ swells, flutes, orchestral samples, distortion of feedback and layers of synths adding to the maddening crescendo, eventually fading into an ambient sound bed developed from the same instrumentation. A hugely creative and original song. Gaz's vocals, almost completely dry and upfront in the mix, have become a point of contention with fans, many strongly disliking them, meaning this is an extremely Marmite song. Billy the Onion. And it's back into psychedelic jam band mode again. Named after the track's harmonica player, Billy the Onion Jones, the piece is a funky psychedelic blues led by Mikey Rowe's Hammond organ and Moog melodies, especially in the groovy descending chorus melody and Garry Lucas's slide guitar. It's the exact opposite of what I want from music really, but I actually really enjoy this track. Even the almost overbearing clutter of so many instruments doesn't bother me so much here. It's very hard to hear any FSOL in the track at all. Little in the way of obvious processing or odd samples other than the delay-coated outro, but it does its job really well. Billy himself was a chance meeting in a Swindon pub, Gaz having been to see Garry Lucas perform with the Magic Band, a moment of serendipity. Another fairy tale ending. Apparently a sonic fairy tale recorded during a trip to the delights of Bognor Regis, another fairy tale ending begins the final run of tracks on Alice in Ultraland, a section that has proved very popular with Amorphous skeptics. Pieced together from orchestral and choral samples, it's a return to the modern classical approach largely ignored on the album's first 12 tracks. The closest comparison point in the band's past catalogue is probably bizarrely 1996's Everyone in the World is Doing Something Without Me. Although much brighter than that track, the choral sound does suggest some similarities. It's a warm, beautiful piece of music, texturally at odds with the previous 55 minutes. Layers of Mikey Rowe's chirping seagull synth, first hidden in closing environments of the Prophet and Indian Swing earlier in the album, combine with reversed samples, harps and strings to create a luscious soundbed that feels like a peek into the future of the FSOL sound, particularly striking after the live psychedelic rock band approach of many of Alice in Ultraland's tracks. The world is full of plankton. Alice in Ultraland's answer to the Galaxial pharmaceutical The World is Full of Plankton is a prog epic. Purportedly named after a phrase overheard on a radio football phone-in show the presenter fed up of the inane and unintelligent commentary he had to put up with, the song deals with the concept of people being small, insignificant and meaningless on a macro level while retaining their own worth and value as individuals. Much like the original Abbey Road version of the Galaxial pharmaceutical, the structure here is brilliant. Fading in from the end of another fairy tale ending, it begins with rain and a lone synth line. Soon a subtly Beatlesy piano chord sequence and a guitar arpeggio come in, gradually building up. Layers of samples are added, betraying the song's roots in the early Isness sessions. Shortly after Gaz starts singing, programmed drums and acoustic guitar chords arrive and it sounds huge. The drum fills in particular are enormous, coated in plate reverb. Reversed drum sounds, choral samples, synth strings, layers of sounds, individual instrument samples and other unidentified noises lend a real FSOL feeling to the instrumental section before the chorus, "You're magnificent but you're insignificant," takes things into the stratosphere. It's a genuine spine-tingling moment that still gives me goosebumps to this day. As the track breaks away into field recordings and samples, I initially feared it would just be a long environmental outro, but then comes the final "I've no doubt that deep down everyone knows" section. The song abruptly closes on an earth-shattering percussive hit. With its layers of samples, synths and programmed drums, this is probably as close to the original 1997 idea of Gaz's songs put through the FSOL machine as an Amorphous track ever really got. The sound design is the duo in full-on FSOL mode. Indeed, the notes on the Amorphous Androgynous site give a story of Gaz writing the song and Yage retreating to the studio for a week to come out with a finished piece. An early version was one of a handful of tracks to leak onto Last FM. It's a simpler affair, backing the piano and electric guitars of The Rose with additional lyrics, but still retains much of the epic apocalyptic feel. Sadly, the unsettling violin samples from the end of this early mix are lacking from the final track. The epic feel of the song led to it being used for a segment of former BBC right-wing driving programme Top Gear, with the presenters driving over France's vast Millau viaduct soundtracked by the song. It was a match made in heaven. I think it would be needless to point out just how much I like The World Is Full of Plankton, other than to say it's my second favourite Amorphous track behind Galaxial. The Wicker Doll. Alice in Ultraland closes on what is, in hindsight, a very telling note. With most of the album moving in a rockier direction away from the group's past, the final 3 tracks feel much more FSOL in sound and no more than The Wicker Doll. Built around piano and keyboard improvisations by Dan Pemberton in his only contribution to the album, as well as Brian's synths and numerous samples, it has very little in common with the Amorphous sound in general. The track proved to be the most popular on the album with members of the FSOL list, with one poster commenting specifically that this was the sign of the direction FSOL would take in the future. They were looking forward to it. I'm not sure if they're aware just how prescient they were, but the remark has stuck in my mind ever since. The original track by track states it began life as an FSOL piece made by Brian for the Never Heard of Again Alice in Ultraland film, suggesting Gaz's contributions to the piece may be minor. The album version of The Wicker Doll is cut from a much longer track, nearing 7 minutes, which can be heard in full on A Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble when Exploding in Your Mind Volume 6. The string samples from that version are cut from the final track, as is some of Pemberton's piano. If an expanded version of Alice in Ultraland ever comes along, my one wish is that this full version gets pride of place on the album that it deserves. If not, it's always on the XFM mix to hear. Regardless of the version, it's a beautiful piece of music that closes the album wonderfully and hints towards the future. The Amorphous Androgynous, The Witchfinder. A promotional single for Alice in Ultraland, The Witchfinder received a radio edit for the purposes of its music video. Not the group's most remarkable video, it features photos from the Gaz and Hippie Friends photo shoot, warped and animated, showing on TV screens in a Yellow Submarine style 2D like cartoon landscape. It was shown on MTV2 a couple of occasions, but due to it not being on YouTube, is probably the band's least seen video. Whether the radio edit on the promo CDR ever received any airplay is unknown, but it was revealed on Facebook that the band had no idea the promo CD even existed. The Witchfinder radio edit. Personally, I would have chosen High and Dry for Alice in Ultraland's promo single, it being poppier than The Witchfinder, but that's just me. The edit is effectively 2 minutes 4 to 5:36 of the original, with a brief intro and outro section added. The Sounds of Monsterism Island Volume 1. On the same day as Alice in Ultraland was released, a rather less well-known album also came out. Pete Fowler, an animator, artist and web designer, had been working with Brian and Gaz since the turn of the century, designing the graphics for the abandoned Mellow Hippo Disco Show project. In return, Fowler's own pet project, Monsterism, featured sound design by FSOL on its website. A magical place of peace and joy, Monsterism Island is the home of all the crazy characters and ideas within Fowler's imagination. In extension to all the imagery, several compilation albums have been released. The first, The Sounds of Monsterism Island Volume 1, features a range of psychedelia, exotica, early electronic music and space-age pop, selected by Pete Fowler and mixed by Brianimal. You guessed it, that's Brian Dougans. The liner notes state that this compilation is an attempt to convey the many sounds and sights of Monsterism Island in such a way as to leave the listener prepared for the eventual disclose to the world of its existence. The credits also thank the band's former A&R man, Rob Manley. A look at the tracklist and credits, and one might expect it to sound like a Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble, and on the surface the two projects share some sensibilities and tracks, but the mood is very different. With little in the way of Indian folk music, jazz fusion and funk grooves, it's a more vibrant, colourful and whimsical record. Brian's presence is subtle but recognisable to fans. Some of the field recordings that link certain tracks, such as the seashore sounds at the very start of the album, are familiar from Amorphous material. Most of the tracks are similarly linked, with field recordings, odd samples and synth squelches, as well as the odd bit of fairground music and spoken word. There's no overlapping of material or crazy use of effects, making it a much more straightforward listen than the Monstrous Bubble shows. The likes of Aphrodite's Child, The White Noise, Dead Meadow and Harper's Bazaar all feature on Monstrous Psychedelic Bubbles, whereas tracks such as John Baker's Milky Way, a BBC radiophonic workshop piece, feel linked to the FSOL side of things. Given his close work with the band in the early 2000s, it's likely that Fowler and the band influenced each other's tastes. The album comes with a fold-out map of the island, located in a slot unusually underneath the digipack tray, identifying the location each track represents, including a warning stating the map is not drawn to scale, and a Keep Monsterism Island tidy logo. The art features a dedication to Martin Denny, who died in 2005 and appears numerous times on the album. Sadly, a second volume never happened, but another compilation, a psychedelic guide to Monsterism Island, released in 2009, features the Amorphous track Mr. Sponge's groovy oscillations. 2 library music releases, Monsterism Day and Monsterism Night, also include Dougans' Cobain tracks, and the band were brought on board to create the soundtrack and effects for Fowler's Monsterism Island TV series. Sadly, after sending the pilot to various children's TV companies, it was never picked up. Brian admitted to me that while watching cartoons with one of his kids, he did spot a show which had a remarkable similarity to it. I love this compilation, so much so I'd say I prefer it to all of the 21st century monstrous psychedelic bubble mixes. It's less overwhelming and the music is just generally more up my street, fun, whimsical, occasionally a bit sinister and creepy. And that's everything for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. Do leave me your thoughts on Alice in Ultraland down below. Did you really enjoy the album more than the Isness? Is it a step down? Do you rate them similarly? Are you slightly sceptical about the record like myself? I'd love to hear your comments. I always love reading them and responding. And there are also like, subscribe and share buttons down there you might also like to press. All interaction really helps my channel, so thank you for everybody's support. I'll be back next week with the promotional mixes and shows for Alice in Ultraland, so I really hope you'll join me then.